Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program, discussing how the pandemic will shape the emerging Sino-U.S. rivalry. We're joined by University of Denver Professor Sam Zhao, who is joined in conversation with veteran ABC correspondent Greg Dobbs. I'm Claire Noble, the program manager for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our executive director, Dale Mosier, our board chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium board, welcome. The Vail Symposium got its start in 1971, and shortly thereafter coined our motto, convening locally, thinking globally, which has served us well for nearly 50 years. While we can't be together tonight in beautiful Vail, Colorado, we are so grateful that you have decided to convene with us online. Some program notes before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option for Q&A, and that's how you're going to communicate with tonight's speaker. Please keep your questions and comments as concise as possible, and I will share those with our speaker later in tonight's program. Tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It is being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at tonight's sponsors, the Town of Vail, the Vail Daily, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, and the Antlers at Vail. Our virtual programs are underwritten by Alpine Bank. The summer season is underwritten by Cindy Ingalls and Leela and Walt Misher. And the Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. And tonight's program is underwritten by Doris Dutton and Larry and Pat Stewart. Thanks to all of you and your generous support. Funding has been provided to the Vail Symposium by Colorado Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, Economic Stabilization Plan of 2020. Please plan to join us on Thursday, August 20th for a discussion with financial and economic experts Jared Bernstein, David Siegel, and Sarah Bloom Raskin. The program will be moderated by Richard Bard, and the program will focus on how we emerge from economic catastrophe and chart a course forward. Tonight's moderator is Greg Dobbs. He was a journalist for almost 50 years, spending most of his time as a correspondent, including roughly 2 decades as a foreign and war correspondent for 2 American television networks, primarily ABC News. He has reported from more than 80 countries around the world, particularly throughout the Middle East and Russia, as well as coverage of the U.S. space program. He is a winner of 3 Emmy Awards and the Distinguished Service Award from the Society of Professional Journalists. And in 2017, Greg was inducted into the Denver Press Club Hall of Fame. Greg hosted Colorado State of Mind for 6 years for Rocky Mountain PBS, and for many years he also wrote weekly op-ed columns, first for the Rocky Mountain News and then for the Denver Post. He's a professional speaker on global affairs and the author of 2 books. Greg, I'm going to hand the program over to your capable hands, and I'll check back in with you later in the program.
Thank you, Claire. After that, I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say. But we're going to talk about and talk with Sam Zhao because he knows China. Sam was born in China. By and large, he was educated in China. He spent the first 30 years of his life in China, and then he emigrated to the United States. And since then, he has been a qualified and credible expert on Chinese policy and ideology and the US-China relationship. And he's been associated with institutions ranging from Beijing University to Stanford to Harvard. And now for you Coloradans in the audience, he is one of us. He is professor and director of the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. But I should make clear that Sam is not an ivory tower professor. He told me on the phone last week that just last year, he logged more than 300,000 miles on United Airlines. No ivory tower professor there, and that's far more than I ever got traveling the globe covering the news. He also told me, I have no life. I have no hobbies. All he does is work. But thank goodness he does, because the work he does is to understand and interpret China, which is ever changing inside out, which makes him, of course, the right guy to talk with about tonight's topic, the coronavirus pandemic and the emerging Sino-U.S. rivalry. Think about it. When we lived through the Cold War, it was all about the Soviet-U.S. rivalry. It was a rivalry to win the race for global allies. It was a rivalry to establish a dominant political ideology, and of course, a rivalry for nuclear supremacy. But to adulterate an old automobile ad, this is not your father's Cold War. The emerging US-China rivalry is a new Cold War. It's a new kind of Cold War where economic espionage and disinformation and cyber theft, where trade and tariffs, where Hong Kong and human rights and military expansion, now even the pandemic, are exploding before our very eyes. So, Sam, that's a whole lot to cover. And I'll therefore start with a very general and broad question to you. Where is this new Cold War going?
Thank you, first of all, for Greg for the introduction, very wonderful introduction, and also for the Vail Symposium for having me to this very prestigious program. To answer that question, let's start from where we come from. I mean, the Cold War we come from. In fact, Greg mentioned that I came from China 35 years ago and lived in China for 30 years. I witnessed the changes of the relationship in the last 35 years, and also since the normalization of the relations about 40 years ago. But I have never seen the situation like we are today. Very, very serious. In fact, the relationship used to be very good. The U.S. tried to engage China to bring China into the U.S.-led international community or system, and also try to change China more like America. And China was willing to learn from America to become modernized. So there was some kind of a grand bargain between these two countries. But this grand bargain disappeared, collapsed in the last 10 or 20 years because US has discovered that China has not been a so-called responsible stakeholder in the American-led international system. China has not become more like America. Instead, China has become a rival, become somehow a challenger to the US leadership. And on the China side, China is rising, developed very rapidly in the last 30, 40 years. From when I came from China, was a very poor third world country, now become the second largest economy in the world. So China has tried to claim its place, a rightful place in the world. In that context, China has discovered from their perspective that US has tried to prevent China from rising to be a peer power to challenge the US leadership. US will not give up inch to the Chinese rise. So this relationship has become much more competitive from those early days of trying to find shared interests, try to find how these two countries could collaborate to the level that these two countries try to find how they can compete. Competition itself, I don't think is a bad thing if you compete for the top. But gradually in the last decade, I have found these two countries have not competed to the top. Very often they are rivals toward the bottom, especially in the last several years. So that's what I use the title emerging rivalry. And each side try to prevent the other side from becoming a threat to its own so-called interests and also its way of life. So that kind of rivalry has led, I think, last year or so, at least a lot of scholars talking about last year, eventually made the world somehow bipolarity. From before that, people talked about multipolar world. The US tried to maintain its unipolar moment, which was not real, only for several years. Then US and all other countries have discovered many countries are rising, especially China rise has made the world more multipolar. But since last year, I discovered many people talk about there is a bipolar bipolarity have appeared because US is still the top dog, the most powerful superpower, and China is catching up very close. These two countries' GDP has count to almost all others, and it's half of other countries. The number 3, number 4 is far behind the US and China. So in that context, is a bipolarity have occurred since last year or year before, but bipolar world is not necessarily a Cold War. We had a lot of bipolarities in history, only one Cold War. But this pandemic in this year or earlier have really brought us to a Cold War. I would argue that the Cold War has been caused by China and declared by the United States. Why I say so? Because in this relationship in the last 30, 40 years, I always seen China as an independent variable using my so-called scholars paradigm, because China has been changing so fast. So this kind of change makes China a challenger to the US hegemony from the Chinese perspective, and US dominance in many, many aspects, and also US values. In fact, these challenges from China, Greg mentioned that I study Chinese foreign policy. I really see the changes in the Chinese foreign policy in the last decade or last 2 decades. China used to be very modest. They have no profile policy, no profile foreign policy, especially after the end of Cold War, try not to take any lead, try to keep its head low. The Chinese diplomats were somehow courtesy, kind of moderate people. But now, those people become warrior diplomats. And China is claiming its so-called big power diplomacy. Because, for example, this competition in the economic, political, ideology, and all security, all aspects has been intensified. For example, economically, China used to be in the low end of the production chain, labor intensive, and manufacture, no value added. And US used to be in the high end, service, high technology. But China has changed. In the last decades also, try to climb the ladder to the high ends of the production chain, even try to be a leader of the new technology, information technology. The Chinese word, they call that new technology revolution, which will determine the future, who is at the top of the hierarchy. So China want to stay, climb up. That will conflict with US economic interests. Militarily and security front, for example, China used to be a continental power. China did not have a large navy, did not have a large air force. It's just a continental army. Try to defend its continental land and also coastline. But China now becomes they call modernized maritime power, and try to have develop its navy, its air force. And the US has traditionally a maritime power. US has dominated the Pacific, where China is part of that, especially on the Western Pacific. And China tried to use its military or maritime capacity to defend its expanded maritime interests, including South China Sea, for example, Taiwan, and all those areas. China thought it had its own sovereign interests and also resources and the territorial integrity, all those issues. So China became much more aggressive in defending those interests that come to conflict with the United States. Politically and ecologically, and China used to be a communist country for sure, but China's reform during the Xiaoping years have somehow downplayed those ideological objectives and adopted some kind of Western values. But in the last 20 years, China's development has been very successful. And that successful development has produced some Chinese confidence in its own path of modernization, so-called China model, authoritarian one-party state-led, what I call state capitalism, which was very, very effective, mobilizing resources from what we can see during the pandemic within 2 months. I mean, initial very disorder, very passive, but quickly they mobilized all the resources, implemented the quarantine of the 1.1 million city overnight. Then the whole 60 million people province within a week. Then the 1.4 billion people of the nation effectively and controlled the virus. And in the meantime, the US and other countries was rampaged by the virus. So far, the US become epicenter of this kind of pandemic. So Chinese people, Chinese leaders, special leaders become much more confident, even try to promote the China model, which I don't think Americans like it, and also other democracies like it. So this kind of authoritarianism, and also on one side, and the liberal democracies on the other side, also come into confrontation. So China's rise has produced these type of conflicts, but China has tried to avoid recognizing this kind of conflict. Still, China said that we are a developing country. We still want to have stability, peace, and multilateralism, which I don't think that's the case. But Trump came to office after 2016 or 17. Trump has totally changed American conversation on China. Even before Trump, there was already tipping point. So Trump has totally using that kind of sentiments to announce a huge war on China. And especially during the pandemic, last month, we saw 4 cabinet members made speeches on China. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, then William Barr, then the FBI director, then Secretary of State Pompeo, all repeat the same information that China is our enemy. It's not only a rival, it's an enemy. US is a threat to the US way of life, to the US interests. So US has to respond accordingly. Basically, here is launch a Cold War against China. So this Cold War has been conducted it's already going on, but declared during the pandemic, has been conducted in the last several months in a whole new level. In fact, when I proposed this topic to this symposium, when I was asked, I think earlier this year, I was not sure what kind of term I should use. I used rivalry, which I thought was very, very strong. Now I think that term is not enough or accurate to describe what's going on between these two countries. It's a really new Cold War. These both countries try to see the other side as the adversary, as a threat, and both sides have been prepared to have a long fight against each other at both levels. At unit level, I said, talking about ideology, talking about those system competition, and at structural level. Each side try to find allies, try and find friends to join them. On the China side, they had Russia, for example, for quite a while. Although these two countries cannot have an alliance, but they have a so-called strategic partnership. And this kind of partnership, now the people have thought they will distrust each other, can all together. But in the last few years, we see these two leaders, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, become such close friends. Within 6 years, they had about 30 times summit meetings. Every year they have 2 regular institutionalized meetings and all other meetings together. And they have economically assist each other in the foreign policy front, assisting each other, and also militarily. They have joined military exercise all over in Europe and also in Asia. And China also has called One Belt, One Road. And also they try to work with, they call it emerging big powers. And those big developing countries like Iran, like Mexico, like South Africa, like Brazil, those countries, try to work with them. They are all non-Western countries to align them to the China side. And also China has One Belt, One Road, which covers 2/3 of the world population. They have 6 economic corridors reach all over the world and try to build a China-centered network of non-Western countries to confront with the United States and Western countries. In the meantime, you can see the US, although Trump has alienated so many allies, but in the meantime, US try to build a coalition or I call containment line against China by rallying democratic countries, European countries, Australia, Eastern European countries, Australia, Japan, and even Canada. These countries have somehow come to the US containment line, not because they like Trump, because they felt threat from China. That's a shared threat, shared concern about China bringing these countries together. So that's why we see this kind of Cold War confrontational line, which is some people called Cold War II, different from Cold War I. We can talk about that later on, but that's what I think the question and the answer I have for your very excellent question here.
Sam, thank you. Do you agree with the characterizations by different American cabinet officials that you cited maybe 5 minutes ago, that in fact China, at least in some ways, does threaten the American way of life?
Of course. That's for sure, because China is a rising power, a second largest economy, which has a totally different culture and history. Americans cannot understand the Chinese, those kind of feelings of their historically humiliation in the hands of the Western powers and their type of sentiments to regain. And also China was a glorious empire before the Western countries came to Asia, came to China. So China, Xi Jinping has used a term called the China Dream to try to restore he called the grand rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. In that context, the world, especially in security front, is a zero-sum game, unfortunately. I don't know if we want to use that term, but indeed, my security is your insecurity. That kind of security dilemma is very real in the world today. Although people talk globalization, yes, all those economic issues, non-security issues, maybe you can see win-win situation. But in a great power competition, it's a zero-sum game. Everybody is alert over even potential threat. So the China's rise in this case from American perspective is a threat. Indeed, as you mentioned earlier, how China could become so successful because the US provides so many assistance to China. During China's takeoff, US opened its market, provide technology, and provide so many investments, know-how, everything. But China, when it developed, they treated America in a very different light. They thought they are now equal player. And also in the process, you can see a lot of research on this. China becomes much more, just like any rising power, try to pursue its expanded interests. For example, in Asia Pacific, in the maritime Asia Pacific, and before their capacities could reach to the south end of the Pacific, they never really claimed sovereignties as they did. There was 9-9, but China's Navy could not reach there. So they talked with joint development. But when China developed their capacities, they built those artificial islands and tried to drive America out of this area. U.S. has fought 2 wars in Pacific. The Pacific War, 3 wars, Korean War, and the Pacific War, and also Vietnam War. But China said, Asian security is responsible by Asians. Basically, America, get out of this area. We are the most powerful nation. And also ideologically, as we mentioned, US democracy now is in dismay. A lot of democracies are in big trouble. And China has attracted a lot of authoritarian leaders using One Belt, One Road, and other programs. Those corrupt leaders did not have Chinese leaders. So, and also, as you mentioned, technology development, China has used all instruments, including espionage and some unlawful ways to get technology, to get economic advantage, everything. So, US is indeed threatened by the rise of China.
You said earlier that it's a race between the US and China to be top dog, and you can separate that into different columns: top dog diplomatically in the world, top dog militarily, and the gaps are still pretty wide between the US as a leader and China today. Doesn't mean they'll stay that way, but it's in economics, at least from an American point of view, that we think we have the most to worry. And yet, there's always a but in life. China's economic system is based on something that has to succeed with a semi-controlled society, unlike the American system. Can it succeed? Can they become top dog? President Xi, his economic plan is known these days as Xi-onomics. Can it succeed in a semi-closed society?
So far, it has succeeded to raise China's economy from only about 2% of the global GDP in the 1980s to now almost 20% of the global GDP. From a very small fraction of the US GDP to about 60-70% of US GDP. And in the purchase parity index, China overtook the United States by IMF measurement a few years ago. But the problem here is that is misleading. I don't think China is as powerful as the US. It's far from overtaking the US, even economically, because in per capita, China has 1.4 billion population, which everyone wants to eat. And the per capita income of China by now is only 1/6 of the US GDP. It's about 10,000, US about 60,000. And US has a lot of allies. Although President Trump has isolated the United States and worsened relationships with many of American allies, but US still have those allies. They share American values. They look for American leadership. As I mentioned earlier during the pandemic, you can see Australia, you can see Japan, you can see European Union. Last year, European Union had a outlook strategy document stating for the first time that China is a systemic threat to the European Union. So these countries shared Americans' concern, although they may not look for Trump for leadership. They share American concern. If a new administration changes everything policy, I think these countries will come back to the US leadership. But China don't have those allies. As I mentioned, Russia. But Russia and China, they could not agree who is the leader. China used to be the little brother. Russia used to be a big brother. As you study Soviet Union, you knew that. Because that relationship, they split. Now, Russia becomes a small junior brother, and China becomes the big brother. I don't think they can trust each other in the long run. And also, Russia's strategic focus is on Europe. Russians always look for Europe, not that the Far East, not the Pacific, its projection capacity cannot reach that area well. China focus is on the Asia Pacific. And also China in this its own home region has so many enemies. The only ally is North Korea, which I think is a more kind of liability than an asset. They have this territorial disputes with so many countries, with 4 ASEAN members, with India now, they had the kind of problems, and with Japan. So China is surrounded by those countries from hostile to unfriendly countries. So I don't think China is in the league of the United States. So many people worry China about China's threat. Yes, there's threat, but China is not the naval of the United States. So when we talk about bipolarity, we talk about the new Cold War. Although some scholars said, oh, China is different from former Soviet Union, which did not have the military economic power to win. China could win. I don't think China could win. Nobody can win. The US cannot win either. Because although US still maintains the most powerful economy, most powerful military forces, but it's not. China is continuing rising. And actually the question you asked, that the authoritarian system has been supported by many people in China. I'm really, really amazed by what I talk to people in China, those political elites. They have vast interest in that system. About 10 million Communist Party members, millions of the state-owned enterprises employees, government employees, a lot of them, it's huge, vast interest in China. You look at all those polls in China, which that have a lot of doubts about the accuracy of those polls, but constantly China ranked #1 in the whole world for the support of the people to their government. And so in that context, I don't think China could be easily defeated. And also, China could be isolated. The Trump administration in this so-called new Cold War, one of strategies is decoupling, to decouple with China economically, technologically, even on the minimum contexts among society. But China, it survived during those isolations in 1950s, in 1960s. So China now has, from Xi Jinping's perspective, you can see, talking about they try to go back to self-reliance, self-sufficiency. And in the meantime, Chinese technology, everything has advanced to the level they could survive, even temporarily set back, but eventually they will come back. For example, AI, artificial intelligence. I read Smith, the Google's former CEO, he wrote just recently article said China is definitely a peer competitor with the United States on this, because for the big data, China's kind of society, authority government can collect them easily without considering privacy or any other legal constraints. When they connect those big data, they can use them to develop artificial intelligence easily. That's why you see during the pandemic, their tracking system, they track everyone's cell phone. They use those technology, face recognition technology, to track everybody's move, everything, to control the virus. But I don't think the US can do the same thing. So that kind of competition is a very complicated, much more complicated than it looks like.
Sam, let me move into what on a contest game show they might call the speed rounds. So some quick questions and quick answers if you can. To begin with, you talk about China obviously as an advanced 21st century nation, but at the same time, you just characterize them in some ways as wanting to go back, to simplify it, to the good old days, the good old ways. One of the cabinet officials in Washington who spoke out last week was the president's National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, and he referred to the Chinese leadership as unreconstructed Leninists, Marxists. Is he right or wrong?
It's right and wrong, both. because the leadership in China is my generation of the people. Xi Jinping is 1 year older than me. These generation people were educated after the founding of the PRC by the Mao's ideology, which is Mao thought, I would say, the Chinese-nized, localized Marxism, Leninism. So these people in their mind, they don't have anything other than what they learned. They socialized. They were socialized, they learned during the 1950s and the 1960s and 70s, which were Marxism. But those kind of Marxism, Marxism thought was very localized because it's not those in Europe, what we talked about. All the key point of the so-called Chinese communist ideology is maintaining the Communist Party in power and tried to gain legitimacy in power, get Chinese people support. They would do everything to maintain in power. So that's the Marxism, which also related to Leninism, because Leninism is different from Marxism. It's more kind of a revolutionary, kind of disciplinary ideology to organize the political party. To hierarchically structure the Communist Party for its political objective. So Communist Party of China is very good at that. The Communist Party is very well disciplined. Now Xi Jinping has emphasized this kind of Leninist discipline in the party and even clean the party. So this is correct, but it's not the only ideology guiding the Chinese leadership. More important, I think the Chinese leaders are nationalists. I don't think they have any ideals. They are not idealists. Ideologues like O'Brien mentioned. They are not true believers in Marxism. Only when the Marxism, only when Leninism, only when modern thought could help them to make China strong, to make Communist Party strong, to make Communist China the top dog in the world, to make the Chinese economy prosper. That's a China dream. That's really exactly the China dream, a nationalistic dream. Chinese have talked all the time about, in China called 富国强兵, to make the country, the nation prosper, to make the state powerful. That's a China dream for 100 years. So that's a nationalist dream. So for that nationalist ideology, if we call that ideology, Chinese government will do everything to compete with the United States, with other countries, to make China a top dog in the global stage. That's what Xi Jinping said. He's so proud to talk about China has been never so closer to be the center of the world stage. That's what he said. That's what Chinese is looking for. Not Marxism, not Leninism, but a nationalist power.
And thus it has been since the establishment of the People's Republic. Another lightning round question. The topic tonight is the coronavirus pandemic and the emerging Sino-U.S. rivalry. You've mentioned the virus maybe twice, otherwise it's hardly come up. My impression is, and you tell me if you agree or not because you understand it better, that the pandemic right now is a sideshow. It comes out of the president's lips every other day as the China virus, but it has come and come with a vengeance, but it will also go. Will it get in the way of the longer term relationship, good or bad, between the US and China?
This is a very complicated issue. I will say the pandemic is that kind of non-traditional security threat to all the countries in the world. In that non-traditional security threat, normally would not see a zero-sum game. In other words, my security is your security. My security is not your threat. If the pandemic could not be controlled in China, it cannot be controlled in the United States. This is very different from traditional security, military security threat. But unfortunately, I'm so disappointed that this issue has become a zero-sum game between these two countries for two aspects. One is prestigious, three aspects I would say. One is prestigious, who will get out of this pandemic first, who develop the vaccine first, who will be prestigious big power. Second, if who can get this out first or develop vaccine first, whose economy would recover faster or earlier. Third is ideology. I'm so amazed by China. This is most on China's side, because when they start this pandemic in early January, they were so concerned. The government was criticized for the bad governance, for poor governance, because they had the issue cover up. They purged those medical doctors. There are a lot of criticisms from both inside China and outside China. Then in March or early April, when they controlled the outbreak, the Chinese leaders found this opportunity to prove their political systems is more superior than democracy. And in fact, that was very, very effective in China. During that process, they launched a propaganda campaign, both domestically and internationally, to celebrate the superiority of the Chinese authoritarian system, which was effective to mobilize resources to command compliance from society, while the West democracies did not do well. So that became competition in the political systems of these two countries or the world. So that's why when you say this is not supposed to be a competition issue between these two countries, supposed to help collaboration, but it have not, really have not. And you can see Trump using Chinese virus, and this competition also prevented the UN, the multilateral organizations to mobilize themselves for this pandemic. For example, in March, UN Security Council was going to pass a resolution to declare the COVID-19 as a security threat to the world. UN Security Council did the same thing for the Ebola outbreak, for HIV AIDS outbreak. So they want to do the same thing. But China was the president, rotating president of the UN Security Council in that month. China said, no, you cannot do that. It's intervening in Chinese domestic affairs. Basically, when that declaration was going to be made, some countries, US in particular, calling for transparency. Chinese regard that call for transparency as a criticism of China. And the US said, if you don't pull that, will not support this resolution. So there was no resolution. When the world needed collaborations, needed UN Security Council, UN needed those multilateral international organizations to work together. There was no way they can work together because of competition between China and the US. So bad. I'm so disappointed.
Sam, thank you. Two quick questions and very quick answers, even though you could probably spend a long time on each one, because then we want to go to Claire Noble with some questions from the members of the audience. But question number one is this: if there is a reset come January in US politics and Biden beats Trump and moves into the White House, what do you expect to happen to US-China relations? I mean, will the tensions persist? Will they soften? Will they harden? What?
I would say the tension will persist because those issues, as I mentioned earlier, are real. They will not disappear. But this competition will be different. At this time is so ad hoc, is so disorganized, and so unpredictable. You don't know what will happen tomorrow. You don't know what kind of policy or what kind of target is tomorrow. But in January, if Joe Biden wins, I think they will continue compete, but will have at much more rational level. We can still compete, but we can also be rational. So in that kind of context, competition will continue, but in a much more predictable way, which I think this kind of competition will continue. In the US, China threat, as we mentioned earlier, is a bipartisan consensus. And I don't think that Democrats or Republicans make much difference in terms of the competition as a way of life between these two countries. But the only difference is US be more rational. When I say more rational, also I told my Chinese friends, at this time you like Trump because Trump is destroying America, destroying alliance. The new administration will come with a much more broader alliance spectrum working against China. So Europeans.
From me, you are the director at the Vail School at the University of Denver of the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation. Is there a chance that word cooperation you're going to have to change?
I think so. I think they are futures of collaboration. Although these two countries could decouple each other economically for a while, but this kind of long-term globalization, long-term production chain, value chain, and also interdependence cannot be disappeared in the long run. We'll come back. And also, as two largest powers in the world, there are so many global issues cannot be resolved without collaboration between these two countries, such as climate change, such as the pandemic, such as the weapons mass destruction, all those kind of issues, crime, cross-country crimes. These countries have to work together in order to resolve those problems. So I think that leaders in the future, if they have visions, they will see those issues. They will compete. The two big powers can compete, in the meantime, collaborate. I think that's the way of life we'll see in the future, hopefully.
I'm glad you say that. That's in everybody's interest. Thank you from me. And now we're going to go back to Claire Noble, who has some questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Greg. And yes, we have a lot of audience questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible, but I apologize in advance if you've asked a question and we don't get to it. So let's just start with the first one from Kim Savitt. She's asked, have you heard that the U.S.-China relationship is described as MAD, mutually assured debt? And don't we economically need one another?
Yes, we economically need each other for sure. But the Chinese economy, the Chinese population, the market is so huge. And U.S. also has been so advanced in technology, in economic development. U.S. has many other markets, many other countries can work with. These two countries could, in fact, decouple independently for a little bit while. But eventually, as I mentioned earlier to Greg, that this kind of a mutually assured destruction if in the long run we don't work together.
Well, a number of people are concerned about Taiwan. And so if I can combine a couple of these questions from both Chuck and Lauren, it is really, what is the future of Taiwan? And do you see it being integrated into China peacefully or by force in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Both are possible, which I hope will be peacefully. The U.S. policy toward Taiwan has been, we don't care about is one China or two Chinas or one Taiwan or one China. What U.S. care is that both sides agree on the solution. And also this solution has to be peaceful. So that's, I think, very clear from American perspective. But the problem now is that these two sides has been separated for over almost 70 years. And each has developed its own identities. And their economies, their political system, their ideologies are so different. And Taiwan in the last 30 years, 20 years have become democracy. So this has made this type of integration or peaceful resolution. I will not say unification. That's what the Americans use the word resolution, much, much more difficult. And also, while Taiwan becomes more democratic and supported by a lot of international friends, but Taiwan also is isolated because China's push pressures on Taiwan. China is a big power now. If just like President Bush said, you are either with us or against us. If you are not supporting our positions, we'll punish other countries. So Taiwan now has only 16 countries recognized diplomatically. Those are tiny countries in the Pacific and Africa, Latin America. So Taiwan is very isolated. So in that context, China has become much more confident in its own terms to take Taiwan back. Since Taiwan is moving aside, Taiwan, especially Hong Kong in the last several months situation in Hong Kong, Taiwan people are so scared. But Chinese leaders become more confident that we can control Hong Kong, we can use the same way to take back Taiwan. So this week, you can see, I read Chinese news, they have a huge military exercise on the two ends of Taiwan Island. Basically try to show to the world, we can take Taiwan back in hours, not days, hours, militarily. So that's very, very dangerous. I don't think that will happen anytime soon, but that's the mindset of people in China. So very, very threatening. I'm very, very concerned about that scenario.
So Bill Mimulus is asking about the claim that China is interfering in the U.S. election, the upcoming presidential election. Is that true? And if so, why their supposed support for Joe Biden's campaign?
I don't know if we can find enough evidence. Maybe they want, but I don't think China has the capacity to do that at this time. And even the Chinese news media people, all those, Trump administration has done so thorough job to cut China's capacities to operate in the US so far. And maybe remotely using electronic instruments, I don't know if they could be successfully interfering US election. But that point also, you mentioned another point, China wants to help Joe Biden. I don't think that's the case. China does not know who is better for them. In fact, from what I heard, more is they like Trump better because they thought Trump has a Chinese name, Chuan Jianguo, Trump building China. That's the name in the Chinese netizens because they thought that Trump is helping China to destroy America. That's what they think. Trump is helping China to destroy US alliances in the world. And I told them, no, Trump is destroying America together with China, destroying China too. And so that's, but some other people say China might like Joe Biden. I think I don't think Joe Biden will be softer on China. And Joe Biden will be more rational, as I said, on China to defend American interests and sometimes maybe pursue mutual interests. But China, I told them, I don't think you can expect Joe Biden softer, better, talk China. And Joe Biden will work with more US alliances and put pressures on China to make changes. So I don't think China understands what is better for them.
So one of the things you hear a lot in the United States is that China is stealing our technology. And so Merv Lappin has a question about this. Does China believe it's stealing US technology the way we do? Or is it a cultural difference between the two systems where the Chinese just think they're being more clever?
I think all those are correct. China has been using all the instruments to get American technology. American using the term steal American technology. Yes, they do use some kind of illegal instruments like using the internet, in the cyber world, espionage type of things. But I think most technology they have obtained are in their words, they're thinking legal. For example, we talk about false technology transfer. The Chinese will say, you come to invest in our country, you have to exchange your technology for the market access. It's a voluntary. If you don't want to give technology, go back.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, and also another way they use that is they recruit a lot of American talents to China. Like myself, those are Chinese Americans. They target these people. I'm not in the social sciences. I don't think they are interested in the social sciences, what I'm studying. But for the sciences, for science, technology, engineering, they pay them a lot of money to go to China, to do research, and also to bring the US technology to China, which from their perspective is legal, but from American perspective is in a borderline of illegal or at least unethical, all those kind of gray areas. So if I have a very simple answer, I would say China took advantage of American open society and to get some kind of advantage in the technology or other economic developments. But it is much more complicated than a single word could describe.
Earlier, we were discussing your colleague, Ambassador Hill, and Ambassador Hill is watching this evening, and he has a question for you. First of all, he wanted to let you know that he thought it was a great presentation, but he asked that you comment on the China-Vietnam relationship.
First of all, I want to give my huge respect, to Ambassador Hill. He has been such a mentor to me in the school, such a big asset for Denver, for the university, for everywhere. He is my hero, patriot in the whole, United States. So I'm so honored he is among the audience. In terms of relationship with Vietnam, I think it's very complicated in those years. Chinese side has not had a clear sense how they were resented in Vietnam. They had those kind of, I would say, condescending attitudes toward Vietnam, because Vietnam used to be so-called tributary state of China. For many years, China was the vassal, and those Vietnam, South Koreans, those were kind of China's lord, those kind of vassal states. So China had kind of those sense, and also for the territorial disputes between China and those countries. China always thought they had historical rights on those territories, and also China former Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi, and once talking to ASEAN countries, said China is a big country, you are smaller countries. That's a fact. That's what they think, that kind of asymmetrical relationship. So those countries had so many resentments on China, but in the meantime, they have a very difficult. They are in a very difficult situation to compete with China. So they need U.S. and other countries to provide some kind of support, and also they try to work with themselves, ASEAN as a collective bargaining institution with China. So at this time, I think the relationship is not good. It's definitely not good. It's very bad, China. That's related to another issue here. We mentioned that China has created so many enemies, so many unfriendly countries around his so-called periphery, surrounding areas. It's not good for China.
So we don't have much time left, but R. Muller is very emphatic that you must address what's going on in Hong Kong right now. And I tend to agree. As somebody who lived in Hong Kong for a number of years, it's very sad to see this. Apparently, it's been referred to as a draconian new law, new security law. Can you address that law that's been imposed on Hong Kong and what that means for Hong Kong, and really what it means for universal suffrage in Hong Kong and democracy in Hong Kong?
I don't think Hong Kong has democracy. First of all, Rich Miller is a friend. He was a consul general in Hong Kong, so he understands Hong Kong much better than I do. But I will say that Hong Kong never had democracy historically, and even under British rule. But Hong Kong has a kind of independent judiciary system and have a free press, which are very important and also have a very free economy. Those are very important for Hong Kong to play its unique role for China's economic development, also for the regional, as a regional financial center. But this has been lost in last 26 years, since 1997, because China has tightened, especially when President Xi Jinping came to office. He really has tightened control of Hong Kong, because he has such a big ego, big ambition that he's the emperor of the whole China, and cannot tolerate the two systems in Hong Kong, free press to criticize him freely, and to have those judicial systems. He cannot arrest people who criticize China in Hong Kong. So he tightened those. And also, I still remember before Xi Jinping, those chief executives from Hong Kong went to Beijing. They met Chinese president. They were in a sit in a parallel. But when he came to office, they sat next to him. That kind of hierarchical relationship was so clear in his mind. So in this process, he has basically abolished, and he's tried to abolish those two systems. He has, from Chinese perspective, they have the power to do that, even the capacity to do that, because Hong Kong economy in the last decades has been going down so dramatically. I mean, Hong Kong is financial center, did not develop technology. I mean, did not catch up this technology revolution. Shenzhen crossed the river of Hong Kong, has become technology center of China. And Shanghai has part of the Hong Kong's financial center function. So Hong Kong is in big trouble. Hong Kong used to have 25% of the Chinese GDP, only now several percent of the Chinese GDP. So in that context, China thought they could afford to take those methods to make sure Hong Kong is part of the Chinese state, authoritarian state. And for quite a while, and Hong Kong internal problems is also a problem there. For quite a while, they have a basic law. Under Article 26 is a national security article, but never been passed because of internal fighting. So took advantage of that. When Hong Kong in the last several years had those kind of young people's uprising, or you can call it pro-democracy movement, or whatever you call that, China found this opportunity. So they imposed this national security law from outside, and which I found is very divisive in Hong Kong today. I talk to people in Hong Kong. Some people support that. A lot of people are angry, but most people outside China in the Western countries are very, very angry on that, because they thought this is a crackdown on Hong Kong's two systems, and also will hurt Hong Kong's economy. But I think from Chinese perspective, they are prepared to sacrifice what they have to sacrifice. In the meantime, for example, I talked to Chinese friends that, oh, those are the companies now, US try to publish them in the US stock market. Now we can list them all in Hong Kong stock market. And it's also the percentage of the trade with Western countries is important, but Hong Kong has survived most because of the link with China.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of complicated situations in Hong Kong, which is all are very bad. In fact, yesterday I had a 15 minutes podcast interview with Hong Kong media called South China Morning Post. We talk about the same issue about Hong Kong's future. Even those reporters, I mean, South China Morning Post, two are British reporters. I talked to them. They also asked me questions before we had a formal interview. We talked, offline. They said, for them so far, they are okay. So I don't know what kind of immediate consequences they have. Those sanctions, for example, against Carrie Lam, the chief executive, she said, oh, I don't have any assets in the United States. Why I should worry about that? And his 10 years visa, he said, I just give up. And the joke of Chinese top person in Hong Kong, he said, I'm sanctioned. I don't have money in the US. How about if I give Trump $100? You put them, you confiscate them as a sanction. So It's really symbolic, a lot of things, then substantial at this point. Hong Kong is already in trouble before there is a security now.
This has been amazing. I wish we could keep going, but our hour is up. Thank you both. This has been great. Greg, thank you as always. Excellent job. Professor Zhao, thank you. This has been wonderful. Our audience tonight, thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone who supplied questions. They were great questions, and I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I hope you will join us next Thursday night. We will be joined by several economic experts to discuss the future of the U.S. economy. Again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.